The first thing I think we need in every single school in England, and actually everywhere in the world, is forgetting about Carol Dweck's work on mindset for kids and starting it on teachers. So basically, the starting point is teachers who want to get better. Not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. You see, if you don't think you can get better as a teacher, any feedback is unwelcome. If you think you're pretty good, then you think you're pretty good, and positive feedback will only tell you what you already knew, and negative feedback will undermine that. So Karl Popper, the philosopher, once described school as a series of unwanted answers to unasked questions. And I think we're in that situation with feedback to teachers. If teachers don't think they need to get better, any feedback is going to be unwelcome. So I think the first thing we have to do is to create that culture where teachers feel they need to improve. Because then, once you've got that, everything else falls into place. I'm trying to get better at this, give me feedback on it. Why do we need to do that? Because of the changes in the world of work, and I'm not going to rehearse those things here. Here's a really important takeaway. There's going to be jobs for everybody, but it's going to require high levels of skill. According to one estimate, about half the work currently being done in our economy will be done by machines. Doesn't mean half the jobs will go, half the work will go. Humans will be working with machines. So the future will be people working with more and more sophisticated technology, and that requires higher levels of education. So we need to shift from, right now, too many of our schools still function like what I call talent refineries. We teach all the kids the same thing, and talent floats its way to the top. Some kids get it, some kids don't, and that's okay. And that was okay in an era when most kids didn't need academic qualifications. Kids didn't need those skills. They could go and actually earn a living with their hands. Those days are gone forever. So the point is we need schools to be talent incubators, and in fact, I would argue even further, talent factories. Schools need to manufacture talent. We need to find ways of increasing student achievement for every single student, more for the ones at the bottom. Now, this is really hard to get your head around, but IQ is the single most important predictor of GCSE success. Ian Deary, the University of Edinburgh, reckons that 80% of the variation in GCSE grades is caused by IQ. And people don't like that fact. People, oh no, IQ is not important, but it is. And if I asked you earlier, do some kids find learning school stuff easier than others? You all said yes. But as David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, pointed out many years ago, you can't deduce an ought from an is. The fact that something is the case doesn't mean it ought to be the case. And if you are getting a bell curve of results in your school, I would suggest that you're not doing your job, because the bell curve is what nature gives us. The bell curve is what happens when we just treat every single kid the same. The kids who find learning easy make more progress. The kids who find learning difficult make less. A stark illustration of that was a recent study from Germany. They extended the school day in Germany by 2 hours. It actually increased the achievement gap, because the teachers put in more content, and so the higher achieving kids found it easy to learn that new content, and the lower achieving kids struggled even more. So the point is, now, okay, so 80% of GCSE grades are accounted for by IQ. Here's what's even scarier. The heritability of IQ is about 60%. The reason that high-achieving parents have high-achieving kids is actually probably not to do with parenting. It's more to do with genes. And nobody wants to talk about this. But ask any genetic behavioral scientist, and they'll tell you the same thing. It's one of those unspoken secrets. Basically, nobody disagrees with this research. Nobody's found any flaws in it. We don't like it because we don't like the conclusion. I don't want to live in a world where taller people are better at basketball. Being quite a short person myself, I think I'd much prefer to live in a world where being short didn't confer a disadvantage in basketball. But that's the world I live in. I don't want to live in a world where kids who have genetically, by chance, just been given a high IQ find learning school stuff easier. That's not fair. They've done nothing to deserve that IQ. I don't want to live in that world. Unfortunately, that's the world I live in. The question is what we do with that. And my view is, one of the things we have to think about very carefully is whether we believe in equality of opportunity, because I now don't. Because equality of opportunity means treating every kid the same and getting the bell curve all over again. I think we have to figure out a way of getting more help to the kids who need it. Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, calls it the basic physics of education. Some kids need more help to achieve at high levels than others. And there are a couple of solutions, like sending the clever kids home on Thursday. That'll close the achievement gap. But not in a good way, and I suspect there might be some political problems with that. So for me, the challenge is, how can we change our schools so that we actually give lower achieving students a better chance at a good life? Because what the PISA data show is that a score of something like 420 on PISA, international average is 500, 420 is needed to take a full and active role in modern society. And we have thousands of students failing to reach that level of numeracy and literacy, and their lives are definitely worse as a result. And so basically, the challenge is, how do you do that in an era where nobody is worrying about those results at the bottom end? That's the challenge for schooling. Because the moral case for giving everybody a chance to take a full part in society, I think is unanswerable. I think it's absolutely stone cold certain. Of course, if you're human, you should be getting the same opportunities as everybody else. Opportunities to participate in society. And that means finding ways of doing that in classrooms, in schools. And so, I think one of the most important things in taking this work forward is to use this rather hackneyed tool, which is the control impact matrix. So it's a rather overused tool in the business world, but it's just about being clear about where you can have your impact. So some things you can control, some things you can't control, some things matter, some things don't matter. So for example, there is no doubt that poverty is an issue in educational achievement. It's become very trendy these days to say poverty shouldn't be an excuse for low achievement. Absolutely agree with that. It's also a mistake to think that teaching kids in poverty is just as easy as teaching kids who are affluent. The fact is that if you're brought up in a stressful environment, there's more cortisol in your brain. Synaptic formation is slowed down when there's lots of cortisol in the blood system. So there's no doubt that it's harder. But the important point is, you as teachers have a very small role to play in this. You can't do much about poverty. You can't do much about school buildings either. But the important point is, some of these things matter and some of these things don't. So you can also worry about, in terms of your own control, you control whether you group by ability. But the evidence either way is pretty thin, actually. People agonize over, is setting good or bad. The effects are so small compared to the things we need to worry about that I don't really care very much about that debate. What's interesting, of course, is that bringing data to an argument about ability grouping is like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Because the point is, ability grouping is not about research evidence at all. It's about what parents want. What middle-class parents want is ways of securing the most valuable resource in the system, which is good teaching.
And friendships.
Yeah, and peer groups, yeah. So basically, it doesn't matter what the research says, schools are going to be under pressure from parents to group by ability, particularly for some subjects. But fortunately, or unfortunately, the effects are quite small either way. The big thing, the thing that all schools can impact, is classroom practice. And I did actually, when I first prepared this presentation, I had a slide on the research. I'm not going to go into that because it just takes too much time. I hope you accept the research that suggests that some teachers are more effective than others. And it's not because of the jobs they're doing. There's research from the Gates Foundation now who, teachers are measured on how much progress their kids make. Those teachers are put into a different school, teaching kids of a different socioeconomic status, and they're still more effective. So some teachers are just more effective than others. And so that, I think, is driving this culture of accountability. Let's grade teachers, okay? Unfortunately, everybody in England thinks they can actually spot good teaching when they see it. And I don't think that's true. I think that most people are completely incapable of identifying good teaching. Because don't forget that learning is a change in long-term memory. If nothing has been changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. So when you're observing a lesson, what you're trying to predict is how much of what's happening in this classroom right now will these children remember in 6 weeks' time. it would be hard enough if that was the only thing going on. But the work of Robert Bjork has pointed out that performance in the learning task is inversely proportional to the quality of learning. The more students struggle and the worse they do on the learning task, the more they remember long term. And the easier the students find and the better they perform on the learning task, the less the long-term learning. So it's really hard to spot good teaching when you see it. That's the sort of theoretical case. Let me give you the empirical case. Can we identify good teachers? So 7 teachers, 3 high-performing, 4 not, were videoed. So the high performers, their value added as individual teachers had been half a standard deviation above the mean for 3 years. So these teachers were always better than average. The last 3 years, every year they looked at their data, these teachers were performing above average. The other group of teachers, they had never been that good. They'd never been above average in any of the last 3 years. Okay, so people were shown these video clips. 100 people were shown these video clips and asked, is this one of the good teachers or one of the not so good teachers? Okay, so the average number of correct ratings is 2.8. Okay, that's a bit depressing since getting 50-50, flipping a coin would have got you 3.5. Let's look at the breakdown here. So teachers, their accuracy was 37%. Parents, 37%. Mentors, 47%. University professors, 41%. Administrators, 31%. Teacher trainers, 31%. College students, 36%. The best performers of all, primary school children. They got it right 50% of the time. Why? Because they were guessing. So this is what's interesting. You know, when you actually find out whether these teachers are actually good teachers or not, and look how people are looking at them, most people perform below chance in saying, is this a good teacher or not so good teacher? Now, you might be able to find different data. One criticism is the differences between the 2 teachers were quite small. So here they did a second experiment. So here you have teachers who are definitely good versus teachers who are definitely bad. Half a standard deviation above versus half a standard deviation below the mean. 165 SLT members, principals and deputy principals, average number of correct 8 ratings, 3.85. So basically, even school principals and deputy principals functioned below chance. We can't identify good teachers by looking at them. That's why the Measures of Effective Teaching project decided to do something slightly different. They decided to look at all the things you might look at. You might look at value-added estimates, see how much progress kids make with that teacher, classroom observations, and student perception surveys. So then they said, okay, what weighting of these 3 things will maximize the future student achievement prediction, and then some other nominal models here. Okay, so what they found was if you wanted to maximize the prediction for how well kids taught by this teacher would do next year, you'd give 81% of the weight to the value-added measures, 17% to the teacher observations, and 2% to the student perception surveys. And using that, you get a prediction, a correlation of 0.69. So this predicts whether these teachers are actually any good with a correlation of 0.69. Now, if you're not familiar with what that looks like, 0.69, well, it's a mess, okay? There are loads of teachers who look good but actually are terrible, and vice versa. But here's the more worrying thing. When they also then saw the teachers who are good at preparing kids for the state tests, are they also good for preparing kids to do well on authentic assessments, which involve higher order thinking, and there the correlation was 0.29. But the more surprising thing is the reliability of the assessment. So if you're predicting teachers' performance next year from this year, the prediction has a reliability of 0.51. Which is very low. You can make it longer by having more data. But what the research shows is to get a 0.9 reliable prediction of how good a teacher is, you need to collect data on that teacher for 11 years. You need 11 years data on teachers to get a good accurate estimate of how good that teacher is. My suggestion is that we've got better things to do with our time. So I think one concrete thing we could do is to stop evaluating teachers, just once and for all. You can't do it accurately. It causes loads of arguments and it gets in the way. Try having a conversation about a teacher about how they could improve when you've told them they're a 4. I mean, they want to argue about the number. They're not in a position to do any learning. There is no upside. I mean, there really is no upside to grading teachers. So I think the first thing we do is to say, let's stop grading teachers. Let's help every teacher get better. Now, what does that mean? How can we do that? I've just claimed you can't measure teachers. So how can you improve teachers if you can't measure them? Well, see if this analogy helps. Let's say there's a line of teacher expertise from weakest to strongest. What I'm saying is the research we've got doesn't allow you to identify where a teacher is with any accuracy, but you can point them in the right direction. So although we can't be sure where along this line this teacher is right now, what we can be sure is this is the way to get better. So I think that's the important point. We can improve teachers without being able to evaluate them. And so, of course, to get the focus right, we need to use research evidence. And I want to echo a point I made earlier, and it's to do with this man called Vilfredo Pareto. So he's best known for his work on tax systems. He's best known these days, of course, for inventing the 80-20 rule. He was the first person to notice that 80% of Italy's wealth was owned by 20% of the population. Many businesses find that 80% of their profits come from 20% of their products. Many heads of year tell me that 80% of their problems come from 20% of their students. So this rule has gained some currency. But the point that he was making was this. You shouldn't raise any more money for taxes until you're sure that you're using the money you've got as well as you can. So, extending the school day is a bad idea. You see, if you extend the school day, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can pay teachers more or you can not pay teachers more. If you pay teachers more, then teachers are better off, kids are better off, but taxpayers are now worse off because education costs more. If you don't pay the teachers more, the parents are no worse off, the kids are better off, but now teachers are worse off because they're working more hours for the same money. It's not a Pareto improvement because some people are worse off. So the big idea that Pareto had was, if you need to take money off to people to give to other people to make things better, that's a value decision that should be a political process. But if you can take resources from one place and make other people better off without making anybody else worse off, that's a technical matter, and you should do it straight away. So the question is, in education, are there any Pareto improvements? Can we improve education without more money? That is what I think schools are going to have to get into over the next few years. And this is particularly relevant when I talk about things like formative assessment, because schools say to me, we don't have time to do this. To which I say, yes, you do. You're currently spending it on something else, less valuable. That's it. There is no more time. There are no more resources. But what you might do, and this is the point I was making earlier about stopping people doing good things, you can stop doing some things and do other things. If, by the way, you get to the point where there are no Pareto improvements, if there is nothing that you could stop doing and replace with something better, if any changes you make will make things worse, then you are Pareto optimal. And the only way to improve the system is to spend more money on it. But my guess is most schools are quite a long way short of being Pareto optimal. There are things we could improve without more money just by stopping people doing good things to give them time to do even better things. And this is where the research evidence comes in. You see, research will never tell you what to do. Schools are far too complex. What I think schools can do is suggest that some avenues for your developments might be more effective than others. And the research evidence is quite clear now. There are some things that we now know definitely don't work. So getting smarter people into teaching doesn't work, paying good teachers more doesn't work, brain gym doesn't work, learning stars doesn't work, and copying other countries doesn't work, okay? Basically, there's no point in trying to do any of that stuff. Things that might work, differentiated instruction. Big debate in America, we don't know. There's certainly no evidence that it works right now, but it might work. Who knows? Lesson study or learning study. Interesting idea. You know, I'm quite intrigued by it. No evidence it works right now. Social and emotional aspects of learning, quite promising. Some research now showing attention to this can produce achievement, not yet convincing enough to make it worthwhile everywhere. Educational neuroscience, no. There is not a single finding in educational neuroscience that has any relevance to teachers. Not one. But what people who tout educational neuroscience do to make it sexy is they show a picture of a brain with some regions lit up in different colors, and then immediately they switch into cognitive science. So what they're actually talking about is cognitive science, but they're making it sexy by showing pictures of brains. There are no findings in educational neuroscience that are of any relevance to teachers. You know, the best model of memory we have is that there's a short-term memory and a long-term memory. It's very powerful. All the work of Robert Bjork, Dan Willingham, John Swell, it's all based on this idea. It's very powerful. Let's say in 20 years' time, neuroscientists discover where short-term memory is in the brain. Ah, there it is. What implications does that have for teachers? None. It's the model that's powerful, not the wetware that supports it. So nothing's coming from educational neuroscience. Recently, we've had grit from Angela Duckworth. There have been claims that grit predicts success more strongly than IQ. It does at West Point. So there's a study that shows that when you look at West Point graduates, those with higher grit were more likely to graduate than those with high IQs. But just think, who are these people at West Point? What you've done is you've squeezed out all the variation in IQ. All these people are just off the charts smart in IQ, so all that's left is grit. So when you look at the whole population, you get a very different answer. I've talked already about growth mindset. And the important point is this. In Carol Dweck's work, the impact on student achievement is not significant. In the only paper that's reported change in mindset resulting in change in student achievement, the impact on achievement was not significant at the 5% level. It was actually what they call bordering on significance. This is researcher talk for, I don't have a result, but I'm going to try and squeeze one in by the back door. So basically, when the result is only significant at the 10% level, you shouldn't report it at all, because you don't know that with a bigger data set, it wouldn't have turned out differently. More significant, I think, more serious actually, the results have never been replicated in any other laboratory, despite at least 3 attempts. In response, Carol Dwecks says, this is all delicate, subtle work. Fine, I agree. But if it's delicate, subtle work, what chance have schools got of replicating it in their own contexts? And Carol Dweck and I and Robert Bjork are on this advisory group for this project in New York, and she was telling me last summer she doesn't know of a single example of schools that have changed their own students' mindsets. Not one. But don't forget, she's talking about mindset as a view about intelligence, which is very hard to change. The point is, what's happening in schools now is very smart. It's actually going back to Confucian ideals. What matters, and they've been talking about this in China and Japan for 2,000 years, talent is less important than effort. And as long as kids believe that working hard helps, the most important word in a teacher's vocabulary is yet. When a kid says, I can't do it, you say, yet. And you remind children that everything is hard before it's easy. Remind children how hard it was to tie their shoelaces when they were first learning, and now how easy it is. And as long as kids understand that effort produces talent, then it doesn't matter what Carol Dweck says, but it's probably not a very original idea. It's just the idea that effort beats talent every time. So, things that work a little bit, firing bad teachers, charter schools in America, vouchers, sometimes class size reduction, but not very much. What the research shows is there are 2 things right now that have a big impact on student achievement. There's curriculum improvement and formative assessment. And if you ask me for my hunch over the next 10 years, we're going to actually be thinking very, very hard about curriculum. I think we're now getting evidence that some curricula are more effective than others. There's a nicely designed randomized controlled trial from America where schools were assigned at random one textbook or another textbook. And so basically there was no professional development, it was just the change of textbooks. And in the districts given one textbook, the kids made 25% more progress in a year. Some textbooks, some curricula are more effective than others. But we don't right now know what makes the more effective curricula more effective. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think that'll probably get done over the next 10 years. So I think one of the levers we can pull in the future will be curriculum. Right now, the only lever we know how to pull is formative assessment. So my hunch the next few years, what is the next 2 years? What I'm arguing is the crucial thing is that schools stay the course. Schools continue to focus on formative assessment as the key focus for professional improvement. Because if you step away from that, you're almost certainly going to be prioritizing something that has a smaller impact on student achievement. Now, we don't know whether there are any limits to how much formative assessment can improve student achievement. Well, what I'm saying is we are nowhere near the limits right now. So given that the focus has to be formative assessment, what does the research show on effective teacher learning? Well, I mentioned earlier the idea that talent is overrated. There are 3 books here that make those points very plausibly. But here's the point I want to make, and this is a point I've made before at the SSAT conference. Expertise has been researched now from a number of areas, and what seems to be the case is that in almost every area that it's been researched, expertise is specific and limited, is only weakly related to general ability, can't be reduced to words. This is really interesting. One of the problems is we try to tell teachers what to do. We never tell people how to ride a bike. How many words, how many pages would you need to explain to somebody how to ride a bicycle? You couldn't do it, could you? So the point I'm making is that I think expertise in teaching is more like riding a bicycle expertise than knowing how to solve equations expertise. I think you will only get good at it by practicing it. You can't short-circuit this. You need to practice it. And what David Berliner's work has shown is that expertise in teaching shares all the hallmarks of expertise in other domains. And what we know in other domains is that expertise is the result of at least 10 years of deliberate practice. So this suggests that most teachers could be as good as the very best teachers in 10 years. I know it's a bit of an arm-waving argument, but for that not to be true, there would have to be something distinctive about teaching that makes it different from chess, violin playing, table tennis, scuba diving, X-ray diagnosis, and all the other focuses of expertise research. So just think about this. How great would your school be if you could pick the best teachers from the entire local authority for each slot in your school? Would you have a great school? Yeah, you would. And you can have that school in 10 years' time by growing it yourself. That's the idea. The research that we've got right now suggests that practically every single teacher could be as good as the best by focusing on creating expertise, by creating an atmosphere in which every single teacher gets better. And the other advantage that has is to detoxify professional development. Because right now in many schools, professional development is toxic because the head says, you're okay, we're going to get rid of you, and you need help. It's a kind of triage, isn't it, basically? Get rid of the ones you can't help the ones you can, and leave the others alone. But then, of course, being identified as needing help is a statement that you're not very good. So it's all about avoiding getting labeled as needing help. What we need to do is to create a culture where every single teacher believes they need to get better, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. And the stakes are rather interesting. The results are rather interesting. So this is a paper recently from Matthew Kraft and John Pape. And what they did was they developed a measure of the level of collaboration in a school. And so they actually looked at, and they basically gave every school a number from 1 to 100, depending on how good the collaboration was. They looked then at how much progress kids made in that school. And so this heavy black line is the average. This line here is the 75th percentile of collaboration, and this one here is the 25th percentile. So let's take a horizontal line there and compare that and that. So in other words, in the high collaboration school, a teacher with 4 years experience functions at the same level as a teacher with over 7 years experience in the average school. So now we're beginning to get really strong evidence that just having teachers collaborate together, creating that culture where every single teacher gets better, actually makes all the teachers better. And what's fascinating to me is now we're able to quantify that. It's just like giving every teacher an extra 3 years experience. And then just to close this out, really, I want to just leave you with a model that you may have seen before, but I think it sort of rounds out the sort of things we were talking about earlier. So Nonaka and Takeuchi are 2 Japanese organizational theorists, and they wrote a book in 1995 called The Knowledge Creating Company. The point that they made was that many companies are more successful than others because they manage tacit knowledge well. So most companies have 2 kinds of knowledge. There's the explicit knowledge, the stuff that you know, and there's the tacit knowledge, the stuff that you can't put into words. Somebody once described tacit knowledge as a kind of knowledge an organization doesn't know it has until the people possessing it leave. And I was talking to a boss in a software company, and he said, the terrifying thing about my job is that all our resources walk out of the factory gates every night. So the point is they couldn't write it down. So what Nonaka and Takeuchi pointed out is that the organizations that handle this well think about the role of tacit and explicit knowledge. So when somebody tells somebody else something as explicit knowledge, they call that combination. If I go to a new school, and I say, what time does morning break end? They say 11:15. I say, fine, thank you. So that's somebody else's knowledge explicitly given to me as explicit knowledge. Only after a while in the school, I realized that although officially the buzzer goes at 11:15, nothing much happens for about 5 minutes. The kids think about coming in from the playground, the staff think about stirring from the staff room, and by about 11:20, people are thinking about being in the right place at the right time. So the point is, nobody ever says this, but over the time, you kind of pick it up. What's the speed limit on a motorway in England? Really? What's the real speed limit? It's probably 85, isn't it? So first of all, they've got to give you 77 because by law, the speedometer doesn't have to be accurate within 10%, so you're going to get 77. And actually, you're unlikely to get pulled over for 80. So the point is, we pick these things up. Nobody talks about it, but you kind of figure it out. And what Nonaka and Takeuchi point out is that in organizations, this happens all the time through a process they call socialization. People just pick things up tacitly, and it's not known by anybody else. Tacitly, people don't talk about it, it just gets picked up. The 2 more interesting processes are what they call externalization and internalization. So when I was a school teacher in London in the 1980s, I was thought to be quite good, so I was asked to take student teachers. Right? You look after this student teacher. And they'd ask me awkward questions like, how do you get the class to behave? And I would say something really stupid like, do what I do, it works for me. The point is, I didn't know what I was doing. And in answering those questions, I was forced to become explicit about things that I'd only held tacitly. So I was actually externalizing my tacit knowledge by being asked to communicate it to others. And the complementary process is internalization. And that's the process whereby you get given a piece of advice and people say, do this. And you think, oh, okay, fine, I'll do it. And you think you understand, and you do it, you think, okay, this is okay. But then suddenly, months later, it all clicks into place. And you say, so that's what he meant. You thought you understood it, but you didn't really understand it until you could actually do it by a process of internalization, making it your own. And what Nonaka and Takeuchi point out is that companies that do well in terms of managing tacit knowledge respect what they call the knowledge creating cycle. Through these processes of learning by doing, sharing experience, dialogue, and networking. And I think these are going to be really important in the future. When I'm in America now, just to keep my my medications. I have to get my blood tested every 6 months. Whenever I get my blood taken, I really hope it's not the doctor, because doctors are just useless at taking blood. There's a phlebotomist there. That's all she does. Never even feel the needle going in. She's got a 2-year degree, an associate's degree, but she's superb at her job because she's done it so many times. And that's the point. We over-intellectualize a lot of these things. And so what I'm suggesting as an agenda for this group taking things forward is to think about how you can use the knowledge-creating spiral to actually begin to record some of this stuff that you've been doing. So yes, you've been sharing experience today. And then you can actually develop some dialogue, networking, and learning by doing. But if we can actually take the experience of this group and using this knowledge-creating spiral, begin to develop tools, artifacts, videos, descriptions, ways of talking about the practices that you've been engaged in, then I think that'll speed up the process of sharing this expertise with others. And that's one of the things we're very bad at in England. There's a thing that teachers do, English teachers do all the time. They have a discussion with the class about a play they just read. They take things from different members of the group. So you're saying that, you're saying that. And they weave it together, right? What do you call that? What's it called, that thing? You can call it discussion, but it's inadequate to reflect that particular kind of discussion. Japanese teachers have got a special word for it. It's called neriage, which literally means kneading, like kneading a loaf of bread. But there's this term they've developed for that particular phase of a lesson where teachers take responses from students, weave them together, or knead them together to actually come up with a coherent whole class account of what it is we've been talking about. What I'm suggesting is that this group can actually become a prime mover in developing a language of description of formative assessment that'll make it much easier for people to actually pick up these ideas with the hope that 20 years from now, we'll have been far more successful in getting people to understand what we're talking about than we have been over the last 20 years.